Hi, I'm Michael Cioni. Recently, I've been able to participate in an early release program for the new Red Hydrogen phone. And as you may guess, the most common question people who see me with it ask is, how is it? Well, I recently traveled to the IBC convention in Amsterdam, Holland, and I figured what better way to test hydrogen than to throw myself onto a new OS, a new phone, in a roaming network while on an international trip. I figured if I can transition cold turkey from iPhone to hydrogen while being abroad, anyone should be able to transition within their normal comfort zones. So I want to focus this analysis on some of hydrogen's camera properties, which is the core of its unique selling points. And if you're like me, you're constantly taking photos, and that means routine smartphone upgrades are probably motivated by improvements to the camera above anything else. So on this trip, I decided not to carry around my Sony a7R II and take pictures exclusively on hydrogen instead. These results were really incredible, and to demonstrate this, I've broken down what I found to be the most important parts of getting a good picture using a camera phone. Now, before I get going, it's important to note that most of these techniques that smartphones use to make good pictures are all based on image processing. It's sort of post-production inside the camera. This is done in order to simulate better images, such as full-frame images or prime lenses. This is not image processing meant to be better than real mirrored or mirrorless cameras. It's just meant to give the impression of a better camera with the added convenience of it being a phone. Everything you'll see in this test is not meant to be scientific. This is just me walking around Europe for a couple of weeks, taking photos randomly as I normally would have done with my A7. So, hydrogen has two cameras on the front which capture dual 8-megapixel images for 2D and stereo capture in HD. The back of hydrogen has 12 megapixel cameras for 2D and 3D is in HD. But you'll notice the rear cameras are pretty far apart, and that's where a lot of hydrogen's technology will benefit you. Advanced depth mapping. We'll get into this a little bit later, but even if you have no intention of shooting stereo mode on hydrogen, the optical configuration that I just talked about is key to getting really impressive images. Okay, first we'll look at hydrogen's simulated magnification. When you launch the camera app in manual mode, users will instantly notice there's a camera company behind this handheld computer, not a computer company behind a handheld camera, like most of us are used to. Pros will be able to appreciate the ability to independently control ISO and shutter speeds, which can help in getting complicated shots or even trick shots without an external app. I also appreciated the ability to control color temp and saturation, contrast and brightness, as well as make use of the real-time RGB histogram. But my favorite hydrogen shooting mode is this automated depth of field mode, which is activated by selecting the iris blade icon. This is where I found I was able to get the most compelling images super quickly, and it elevated my hydrogen images way above my expectations. For example, in this image of Mark Bird from Teradek RT, we have a normal wide-angle phone capture, but since hydrogen's 12 megapixel imager is so small, everything appears flat and two-dimensional, which is to be expected. But after I switch to the simulated depth of field mode, the image becomes far more dimensional, and this illusion of increased magnification takes place. Now, this particular trick isn't revolutionary. In fact, iPhone users know this as portrait mode. But what's impressive here is I found hydrogen's ability to create and cut complex mattes and interpret complex shapes is superior to what I found on iPhone, making the illusion a lot more authentic. iPhone relies on a face to pull this off really well. Hydrogen's stereo mapping technology doesn't. Here's a simple example of a complex matte. In this shot, Aaron Kroger is well separated from the background, even though the background's about 3 meters behind him, and he and the DXL represent a complex shape. Here's another complex shape in which the bike, the rocks, and the pole are not uniform or close together, and hydrogen's depth mapping is able to interpret them and render what looks like a highly magnified image. Most impressively, it correctly interpreted the rock on the left, which remains sharp, and the rock on the right is blurred, even though they both border the bicycle. It even works well when you are far from objects. In this example, the light post is about 4 meters away from me, and it was still able to create the depth map in order to give the impression of large format magnification. So for people that like large photography or full frame photography, hydrogen's magnification and depth of field mapping is good enough to fool a lot of your followers, and they might think you were shooting with a much larger imager than you actually were. Next, I want to look at hydrogen's simulated depth of field transitions. When you shoot with prime lenses, the fall off, the bokeh, the blurring are all trademarks and characteristics of Z depth cues. In this image, Mark Goossens, who happens to be an excellent bass player, he looks great, but there are no Z-depth cues in this shot. When I put hydrogen in the depth of field mode and get closer to Mart, he becomes much more dimensional. But unlike iPhone's portrait mode, the simulated transition on hydrogen is stunningly accurate. Notice how the phone maps the bass fret blurry and then slowly until it lands on the plane of his face. His right arm is only slightly soft and the background behind him increases softness substantially. All you do is tap the area you want in focus and hydrogen calculates a depth of field table and renders the result after you take the photo. In this example of the wood, I picked the focus near the edge of the log. Hydrogen is able to correctly map the wood plus the foreground and the background very realistically. The foreground grass shows excellent control of slow transition, much more realistic than other simulations of this kind. Here is an example of extremely complex shapes in the grass and the trees. I can show both close and infinity focus without a clear object to map, such as a face. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And here's an example of a medium shot where I can set my focus with really authentic control. Cables and awkward edges were well rendered, and if viewed online, this would almost certainly pass for a full-frame photo. So next I want to examine high-frequency images. These are images where basically everything falls into focus and there's a lot of details to render. Over the years, smartphones have really improved in this area, but hydrogen is made by Red, which arguably has the most advanced compression available in the world. They pay attention to this area a lot. Here is an example of a high-frequency medium shot. If I zoom in, you can see the quality of the compression and the quality of the lens doesn't seem to break down like you might have found on other camera phones when you zoom in really far. One of the hardest things to compress is water, especially when it's moving. But in a still, here is a wide shot of high frequencies, and again, when I zoom in, the image remains impressive. Here is a shot I see a lot with smartphones, and hydrogen has excellent control of these small branches even when they are close to 75 feet or 25 meters away. And this example combines the depth of field with high frequency, and is actually one of my favorite shots I took because it has dynamic range, it has good light and dark, it has close depth of field, and high frequency all in one shot. And that leads us to the next area, close focus, which is something I enjoy shooting a lot. This actually is one of those areas that smartphones can often beat full-frame cameras. In this example, hydrogen does a great job of capturing close focus. Michael Keegan is less than 1 meter away from me, and the Z-depth line is cut very cleanly from foreground to background. Here's an extreme low light example to show the bokeh with the background about 30 feet or 10 meters away from me. The 4V camera seems superior to Apple, and it clearly does better depth mapping in nearly all distances. Here are some great lines in bright sunlight, and here are some great lines in the dark. If you like macro photography, then you're going to love how the 4V cameras on hydrogen capture excellent close focus with natural roll-off in order to make your images look extremely dimensional with limited artifacts. Next, I want to talk about dynamic range. This is a test that could stand to have a little bit more scientific analysis. But there are a few ways you can look at it. First, if you really want total control over your dynamic range, do not shoot with a phone. They have built-in image processing, and even with hydrogen's controls, there's limited control compared to a professional still camera. Second, when I think of dynamic range on a phone, I think about point and shoot situations. In this example, here's a photo I took from the Red Shark news party on the roof of the Torin Hotel. The image on the left is iPhone, the image on the right is hydrogen. When I shot these photos, I simply tapped the highlight area caused by the sunset in the center of the frame on both phones and took the photo. Both cameras have a great starting point, but there seems to be a little bit more color separation in hydrogen, and it looks a little synthetic. Now, I personally used to own a post house, so I spent a lot of my career explaining to people not to judge cameras based on their native outputs, because you can change all of that later. So that being said, the important thing to remember is since hydrogen comes from the Red company, raw image capture is part of hydrogen's roadmap, and in time we will have massive gains in the raw image control area as the hydrogen program matures. This is a feature to look for in the near future. But lastly, I want to touch on resolution. Small rant here. In my opinion, one of the worst things that's happening in society is that millions of kids are going to grow up and be very disappointed to learn that their baby photos and their holiday photos and their Halloween costumes are going to be captured with terrible quality photos. And that's considering those photos still exist. But I get it. Convenience outweighs quality. So when it comes to shooting images with a phone, resolution will help increase the overall quality so that these images will better stand the test of time. So in this daylight exterior example, you can see how well the 12 megapixel resolution captures and how efficiently it's compressed. When I zoom in, there's pretty good detail from the stock photo settings. In night photography, it's also pretty impressive. In this example, the resolution and sensitivity was pretty exciting. There are some really small details hidden amongst the shadows, and I was surprised as to how well these were being captured. Considering a lot of people will use hydrogen for social media feeds, the resolution will be very useful in super sampling your images and correcting them or reframing them down the line. So I hope this analysis has been useful. As always with pros, it's important that everyone does their own testing. But if you're on the fence about buying a hydrogen, or you're not sure if it's worth it, or if you've ever argued with yourself at the door whether or not you should take your SLR with you, I can say that if you want high quality photography in your pocket, hydrogen will not disappoint you. Of course, there's this whole 4V screen thing that is better than 3D without glasses, which is impossible to demo on this platform. But if you want to know how that feels and looks, just Google Mark Toya hydrogen and you'll get the same open mouth reactions that I've been getting every day. Actually, that's probably my favorite part. I love opening people's minds to technologies that they don't yet have or possibly don't understand. Now, it's great to have friends that believe what you believe because you need to spend a lot of time with them, but it's also important to spend time with skeptics and cynics. Seeing their reaction to hydrogen and other technologies like it are far more rewarding than just conversing with all the other early adopters. And that's probably the most important thing about this whole story. Hydrogen is one of the most camouflaged emerging technologies in the world today. What hydrogen is going to do is totally under the radar. This is the first technological link between smartphone and cinema. 15 years ago, when I came to LA, people used to tell me that real filmmakers would never shoot on digital cameras. Thankfully, that perspective has evolved. The future of technology will continue to be more and more democratized, and the tool set gap between the beginner and the elite will continue to shrink at an exponential rate. Today, I don't yet consider hydrogen to be a replacement for photography or let alone cinematography, but the building blocks for something entirely new is all here. Today, hydrogen is a smartphone that imitates forms of cinema. Over time, hydrogen will become a cinema system disguised as a smartphone. And we've been here before. It's technological breakthroughs like GPS and iPod and 3D printing and the Red One that allowed us to explore a completely fresh direction. You watch, shooting on hydrogen will start like all of those disruptive innovations, premature and a little odd at first, but then it will rapidly improve and it will scale and it will expand, and eventually hydrogen will go from a strange choice to possibly being a standard one.